The thing about living in a beach town during the off-season is that it feels deserted. The tourists are long gone, the storefronts are mostly boarded up, and the boardwalk, the heart of the town in the summer, is nothing but an empty skeleton of itself. I like it, though. It's peaceful. That's why, for the longest time, I'd go for late-night runs on the boardwalk in the off-season when no one was there. It was my detox from life and all the stress that came with it. Sometimes you just need to be away from people. There was something about the sound of the waves and the rhythmic slap of my sneakers against the wooden planks that calmed me. It made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. Tonight was no different. The air was crisp, carrying that scent of salt and damp wood. The only lights came from the occasional street lamp, buzzing faintly and casting long, lonely shadows. I was maybe a mile in when I got that feeling, the one where you just know you're not alone. I glanced over my shoulder. A man stood in the distance, not walking, not moving, just standing there on the boardwalk, facing me. I swallowed and turned back around, shaking it off. It was probably nothing, maybe just another local taking a walk. But honestly, no matter what, that's still an eerie sight to see. I kept running, but a few minutes later, the feeling of being followed or watched came back, even stronger. My heart thudded more intensely, not from exertion, but something else. The curiosity to turn around again thickened, so I turned around again. He was closer, still not moving, still just standing there facing me. A deep, crawling unease settled in my stomach. I picked up the pace now, taking out my one headphone that I had in. My feet pounded against the wood, breath coming quicker, but every few moments I heard footsteps behind me, in sync with mine. I turned again. He was even closer, but still, he was completely still. I broke into a sprint, but the soothing boardwalk felt like an endless trap, stretching too far in both directions. My car was at the very end, parked right by the beach entrance. I just had to make it there. I ran harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I refused to stop. Every few seconds, I turned my head just enough to check, and every single time, he was a little closer, still standing and still watching. I didn't understand how he was able to stop so suddenly every time I turned around. I wasn't even looking where I was going anymore, just focused on getting away. The boardwalk exit finally came into view, and I nearly sobbed in relief when I saw my car. I fumbled for my keys, hand shaking so badly I could barely press the unlock button. Finally, the lights flashed, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. I turned the key in the ignition and backed the car out of the spot. When I put the car in drive and whipped the wheel to the left to turn out of there, I looked ahead, and the man was standing directly in front of my car, right where my car had just been. But I looked at him so briefly that I didn't even have time to make out any features. All I saw was that he had his hood up, covering a decent chunk of his face. I cranked the wheel to the left and almost spun out as I whipped my car out of there. The entire way home, I didn't care if I ran a red light, if I swerved, or if I nearly spun out. I just drove. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, every possible entrance. I didn't sleep that night, and I've had a couple of nightmares referencing that experience, both in which that man appeared in some form, watching me or chasing me. My mind created its own versions of what he looked like. I guess, since I really didn't see his face, they were not pretty images. I haven't done a winter run on the boardwalk since. I want to start by saying, if anything I say comes out wrong, I apologize in advance. Looking back, I was so young when this event happened, it feels like it could have been just yesterday. I don't remember my exact age, but I must have been around 8 or 9 years old. What I do remember, though, is that it was one of those summers spent at our grandparents' coastal house, the kind of place where time feels suspended in the salty air and sound of waves. That house was like the beating heart of our family. Every summer, no matter where we lived, we'd all converge there. My siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts, and especially our maternal aunts. It didn't matter that the house wasn't grand or luxurious. It had enough rooms for everyone to sleep comfortably, and it was perfectly positioned close to the beach. My days were filled with running around on the sandy shore or pedaling my bike through the neighboring areas, lost in my own world. Now, when I think about those summers, they almost feel like a distant dream, fading more and more as I grow further away from the innocence of childhood. But this particular summer was different from all the others. The forecast was grim. A massive storm was on its way. It wasn't just any storm either. It was one that had been on everyone's radar for months. Coastal towns had already begun taking serious precautions. In our city, massive sand walls were built along the beach, towering high enough to catch the eye of any child. To me, they seemed more like fortress walls than anything. I can still remember how surreal it looked. Those colossal structures lining the shore, a stark contrast against the usual peaceful scenery. And I can only imagine how it would have looked from above, like some strange alien landscape in a place I knew so well. My siblings and cousins had a blast with those sand walls. We'd climb them, tumble down, and pretend we were scaling mountains or sneaking into castles. The usual view from the wooden boardwalk was of the vast, open sea, but those towering sand walls had completely blocked it out. As soon as you stepped onto the boardwalk, instead of the shimmering water, all you saw was this massive, impenetrable barrier of sand. It was as if the beach had vanished, replaced by something much more imposing. After a certain time, the beach would close, once the lifeguards finished their shifts and people weren't allowed to stay. But that rule hardly mattered to the locals. It was one of those close-knit towns where everyone knew everyone else, and kids running around freely was just part of daily life, especially when the tourists were gone. As long as we promised not to go into the water, our parents didn't mind much. At that age, I was a bit of a troublemaker, especially when I thought I could get away with it. That's probably why I sneaked out that evening. It wasn't quite dark yet, just before sunset, but I hadn't asked for permission. Maybe I had argued with my brother about something. I can't remember exactly. Downstairs, near where the kids' rooms were, there was a sliding door that led outside. It was easy to open, and my older cousins often used it, so I'd learned how. So barefoot and without shoes, I quietly slipped out, heading straight for the boardwalk. I was hoping to find some other kids or locals hanging around, as there were usually people on the beach even after dark. But that evening, everything was eerily quiet. There was no one. The beach was completely deserted. It felt strange. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I walked along the boardwalk for a while, hoping to see someone, but it was all silent. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed something odd. Smoke was rising from behind one of the sand walls. At first, I thought it was just fog, but as I drew closer, I realized it was smoke. Actual fire smoke. Lighting fires on the beach was usually against the rules, though sometimes people would sneak in a campfire. But this felt different. In that emptiness, with everything so still, the sight of it made my skin crawl. My parents had always taught me that you should never ignore someone in trouble. So, despite my growing unease, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to climb the sand wall. When I reached the top and looked down, I saw a bonfire still burning. But there was something unsettling about it. There was no one around. No chairs, no coolers, no belongings. Just the solitary flames flickering in the quiet night. It felt as though whoever had started the fire had simply walked away and left it to burn alone. That eerie sight made my heart race. Compelled by a sense of responsibility, I stepped closer to the fire and began to put it out. I kicked sand onto the flames, desperately smothering them until the fire was finally extinguished. But just as I was about to leave, something even stranger caught my eye. Scattered around the fire were children's clothes. Shoes, socks, and half-burnt garments littered the ground. My stomach twisted. I used a stick to carefully poke through the items, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Burnt photographs. Most were too charred to make out, but one photo stood out. It showed a child's face, clearly visible despite the damage. That child looked shockingly like me. If someone had told me it was my cousin, I would have believed them without question. A shiver of dread swept over me. I wanted to run, to get away from the unsettling scene. But before I could move, a loud voice called out from behind me. "Hey!" I spun around, startled, to see a man approaching. He was bald, and his walk was erratic, like he was stumbling, perhaps drunk. "Hey, kid, stay right there!" he shouted. I froze. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't make my body move. Then, just as panic set in, something snapped, and my legs kicked into action. I sprinted toward the sand wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Running on the soft sand was difficult, and I could hear his footsteps closing in behind me. Just as I reached the top of the wall, I felt his fingernails brush against my leg. By some miracle, he couldn't grab me. I tumbled down the other side and sprinted straight home, not stopping until I was safely inside. I locked myself in my room and broke down in tears. I wanted to tell my parents what had happened, but I was terrified they'd be more upset that I had snuck out in the first place. So, I kept the truth to myself. To this day, there's been no news about that night. No police, no reports of missing children, nothing. But that picture, that child who looked like me. Sometimes, I wish I could go back and tell my younger self to speak up, to tell the truth. But now, that secret stays buried with me, hidden in the past, never to see the light of day. If you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our latest scary stories. Your support means a lot to us, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you.